So next up we have Maarten van Horenbeeck. He's come over from all the way from San Francisco. Talking is very good for me today. And his presentation's got Global Commons or Connected States, the contest for the soul of the internet. I'm actually really looking forward to this presentation. So Maarten's going to tell you a bit about himself, so a subject matter I'm sure he's very, very aware of. So let's give a round of applause to Maarten.
Thank you very much for the intro, and great seeing everyone. Thank you for coming out. So my name is Maarten van Horenbeeck, and I'm a board member with the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams, which is an association of incident response teams. Outside of that, thank you very much. Outside of that, I also work as a lead expert for an initiative called the Best Practices Forum on Cybersecurity, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later. And I'm also the Chief Security Officer for a software company based out of San Francisco called Zendesk. Now, one thing I wanted to give you as a bit of a starting point is the context behind why I'm actually interested in this specific problem and how it actually also affects you. And I want to give you a little bit of an intro into what's happening in this space. And something that for me matters very, very deeply is that we recognize that as incident responders and as members of security teams, we actually all need to work together. There is no way we can win by ourselves. A little bit, if I go back to the keynote from this morning from Mikko Hipponen, if you look at that castle and the walls that we're building around it, if we're all building our own walls, we're going to lose. However, if we work together and we understand from each other what the challenges are, and we can work across those walls and actually benefit from each other's experience, we're going to be a lot more effective. And that's really what FIRST as an organization is all about. We have members in 84 different countries. Actually, I need to update the slide because it's 92 today, which are all incident responders, just like yourselves, people dealing with and responding to cybersecurity incidents. As an organization, we have one big vision for us as a community, and that is that we are the organization that helps incident responders be more effective. And we want to do that in 4 different ways. First is by creating this community where you can actually connect and coordinate in a global way with other incident responders. We want to make sure that we all speak the same language, and that doesn't mean that we all speak English, even though I really do like the Aussie English accent, so that would be what I would be rooting for. But we want to make sure that everyone understands the terminology that we use and the problems that we work on. We also want to make sure that automation is easy and that automation exists. So working on making technologies like the SOAR technology that the previous talk here was about more widely available is really, really important for us. And finally, we started recognizing a few years ago that there were a lot of policymakers that got really interested in cybersecurity and in incident response, but they didn't always understand exactly what it was that incident responders did. So we actually wanted to work on figuring out how do we get them in the loop and how do we make sure that they understand what we do so they can actually help us instead of sometimes maybe perhaps making life a little bit more difficult. And we do that in a couple of different ways. This is a photo of my colleague Adli Wahid, who is actually also here at the conference, when he met with the newly built incident response team of the country of Bhutan in the Himalayas. So we do a lot of capacity building. We meet with a lot of new certs. We create standards and technologies that they can pick up and that also you can pick up for your incident response teams. And almost everything we do in that manner is released as Creative Commons, so you can actually use it. This is another example. This was a debate in 2012 at a conference called the Internet Governance Forum, organized by the UN, where there was discussion about whether or not countries should be working together on a law of the seas, a very big idea at the time that would cover cyberspace. And we provided some technical input from the incident response perspective and shared with them the different things that would work and wouldn't work if countries would move into that direction. And then finally, we do a lot of training and education. We have open source training for incident responders, which we teach in various places. This was a training that we did in Côte d'Ivoire. But it's actually also available for free from our website, so you can actually go download it there. Now, the talk today that I want to give you is all about whether or not we should be pursuing a global commons or an internet of connected states. And I want to be really clear about it because it is actually a choice that we have, in a sense that we can look at the internet as oceans, as forests, as things that are communal between people, between countries, and that we all have to work on together and partner on managing it. Or we can decide that we're all countries in it for ourselves, and the only ways we really interoperate is by trading, by signing treaties, by agreeing. And in reality, we will always figure out someplace in the middle rather than leaning completely in one direction. But I think today we're very much in a place where some of the things that are happening are not really very conducive to getting us to a place where we actually manage the internet as a resource that is shared between all of us. And I want to use 3 quick examples to actually walk you through that. And in order to do that, I'm going to make a blitz trip from Iran to Amsterdam to the Ukraine. And we'll get started with an event that happened in July 2010, and which I think changed a lot of how people perceive what the internet is and what impact it has on states as we know them today. And that was, of course, a piece of malware called Stuxnet. Now, at the time, I was lucky enough to work in the Microsoft Security Response Center in Redmond, and so I was very involved in the initial response against Stuxnet when it took place. But one of the big takeaways for me was the technical complexity of the issue. So here was an attack that actually exploited 4 zero-day vulnerabilities in various pieces of software, including Windows, but also the Siemens Step 7 software, that actually had a physical impact on the world and bypassed a air-gapped network. So it made its way onto a network that wasn't even connected to the internet in the first place by exploiting a vulnerability in how specific file types were being parsed on a USB stick. Now, what was really, really interesting for me about Stuxnet was how the countries that were later on assumed to have something to do with initiating the attack were some of the first ones to be really, really concerned about it. When Stuxnet originally hit, the organizations that me and many other security professionals ended up meeting with to give them more data on what was actually happening and how they could actually protect against it, were in many ways the countries that were later perceived as being behind the attack, because they had a lot to lose. They had a lot of infrastructure, they had a lot of power plants that were connected that could potentially be affected because they used similar centrifuges, similar devices as what was actually being targeted by Stuxnet. So it was a very, very interesting incident that completely spread beyond the intended scope. It was probably a state attacking another state's nuclear program, and simply by virtue of doing that, they actually spread across the world and ended up affecting a lot more systems. Now, none of those other systems were affected in the negative way that the target plant was, but keep in mind that during the initial response, because of the size of Stuxnet, nobody really knew that until quite a bit later. So the initial response was very frantic. It was trying to figure out what is this malware doing and how do we stop it. So this became a very big problem, and it actually changed the way that a lot of countries ended up thinking about malware and what malware could actually do. Moving forward 1 year to 2011, there was a small company in the Netherlands called DigiNotar. And DigiNotar is a root certificate authority. So when you look at any laptop, it has about 150 companies that it trusts to attest that, for instance, a website is actually owned and operated by Google. Now, DigiNotar was a CA that was a bit particular because it also happened to be a CA that provided services for the Dutch government. So it had this commercial part of it, but it also had essentially digital certificates that were essentially signatures by law and were being used by the government in many different capacities. Now, in that month, or actually a few months before, there was a compromise of the CA. And someone broke into their systems and used their hardware security modules to issue new certificates for sites such as google.com, but also, for instance, for mossad.gov.il and mi5.gov.uk. Now, there was no indication that those certificates were ever used, but the Google one specifically was used to man in the middle about 700,000 connections, all from Iran, made by individuals checking their Gmail. So the attempt here seems to have been to man in the middle email traffic from Iranians when they were trying to connect to Google. And the attack actually worked for a couple of weeks until it was discovered by a user in Iran that was using Google Chrome. And a new feature called certificate pinning actually flagged that it was a problematic connection and there was some type of attack taking place. Again, a very, very interesting incident because the entire world was really affected by this one compromise in the Netherlands, even though the target of the attack in this case were people that were based in Iran. So again, you see this attack spreading way beyond what the original attack was, and in fact, this particular incident kickstarted a whole set of incidents then in the CA community that were later on discovered. And now we have better technologies, luckily, to be able to spot them. But at the time, it was a fairly immature place, and it really pinpointed a weakness that ended up being exploited in a number of different ways. And then finally, moving forward to something a little bit more recent, in June of 2017, several companies, international companies that had business operations in the Ukraine, downloaded a security update for an application called MEDOC, or rather an update for an application called MEDOC. MEDOC was accounting software that a lot of international companies used when they did business in the Ukraine because they needed to have the ability to file taxes in the Ukraine, and it happened to be the most convenient software for it. It just so happened that these update servers were compromised and were actually used to provide a piece of malware called NotPetya to the machines at these different companies that were downloading updates. Now, when they got these updates, they were infected with NotPetya, which was seemingly ransomware, and ended up taking a lot of very, very large organizations, including, for instance, the shipping giant Maersk. Now, this was a particularly interesting incident because it both undermined the update mechanism of a very common application in the country. It was clearly targeted towards companies doing business in Ukraine, but because it also exploited a vulnerability that allowed it to infect over the network, it spread out to other offices of these companies in different countries. And there's many different assessments of how expensive NotPetya ended up being, but 10 billion is at least one number that was thrown around in a Wired article a little bit later. So it was a very, very expensive attack. And in fact, there was a very interesting outcome from this as well quite recently, where a cookie manufacturer ended up filing an insurance claim for the damages that they had for NotPetya. Now, the insurance claim that they filed was under property insurance, not cyber insurance. So it's a little bit different than a typical cyber insurance claim, but that particular claim was denied because the company was, according to the insurer, affected by an attack that was actually warlike activity. So the systems that we have built to protect our own organizations, both in terms of defending against attacks, such as installing updates, were used against us to compromise our own networks. And then our insurance providers are getting to a point where some of them at least are declining insurance because there's warlike activity happening. So you can see that the impact of these incidents is pretty tremendous and has a lot of impact on us as organizations, and really, in many ways, as internet users and netizens. So when I talked earlier about the fact that we could be a global commons, or we could be a set of interconnected states, there's actually some really interesting work that was done a few years ago by an academic at Indiana University. And she actually got the Nobel Prize. Her name is Elinor Ostrom, for her work on identifying how communities can actually govern the commons. And many of those things include making sure that as a community, when you herd your sheep in a particular field, you can only herd as many sheep as you've actually been able to care for 5 years before. There's many different rules and principles that she identified that are very, very helpful. But as you can see, we are right now in a dark place where things look a little bit differently, and we don't seem to be thinking about the best interest of the internet. And in fact, we're just trying to get short-term benefits. And so a very important question for me, and also for FIRST as an organization, is how we actually break this negative cycle and how we end up in a community where we all work together on making the internet safer. And some of these behaviors that I just talked about, which all seem to be state-initiated, are not considered reasonable. And some offensive activity by states we will never be able to exclude, but the activity that impacts very large communities, that removes trust from individuals on using the internet and makes our life very, very hard to actually operate businesses reliably in the internet as we do in our legal systems within our countries is absolutely unacceptable. And there's a lot of work going on in the community to get to a better state, and I want to use today to talk to you a little bit about what is happening in that community. But before we go there, I need to cover something that is probably the driver for a lot of these issues, and that is our national interests. Now, some of you may recognize this. This was a chip that the US government in 1993 started promoting. It was called the Clipper chip. The idea behind the Clipper chip was that it would become possible for everyone to have encrypted communications over the phone, with one little exception. That was that the government would be able to listen in on every phone call. And this chip was the guarantee that that would happen. Now, the chip didn't end up being very popular because I live in the United States. I'm actually from Europe, but people in the United States don't always trust the government very much. So as a result, they didn't necessarily want the government to listen in on all communications. But you can see that that same issue actually is just part of a much wider and longer conversation that started off with export controls. Until the early 90s, much of encryption was actually on the ammunitions list in the United States and was not something you could export. Then there was the Clipper chip. There was something called dual ECDRBG, which was a pseudo-random number generator that was widely believed to contain a backdoor, but that was considered to be a relative standard and promoted by the US government. And finally, today you see a lot of discussion about the FBI and Apple trying to figure out how does law enforcement actually get access to data on phones? So these are very big societal problems. There are no necessary easy answers for any of these. These are trade-offs that we need to weigh as communities. But you can see that quite often the problems run over a very, very long period of time. And it kind of brings into context how the definition of a state actually is being a little bit criticized by this concept that we have, which is the internet. Miko this morning made a much better argument than I ever could for why there are no more borders. Everything right now is transnational when you think about the internet and how it works. We don't really have solid international laws. We have some work that's happening there, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but there is no real common understanding what is cybercrime. A really interesting thing for me was when I moved at a certain point in time between employers, and I went from a software company to a company that was more an online services provider. And suddenly I was being contacted by very much the same people, but about very different issues, which they consider to be cybersecurity issues. At the software vendor, I ended up working with them on security vulnerabilities. At the online services provider, many of the questions I got were around videos that were being posted to the service that we actually operated and that they consider to be a cybersecurity issue. So there isn't really a lot of agreement there. Another thing that is critical about a state is that a state has the unique ability to engage with other states. So for instance, if I get off a plane here in Australia and I tell you I'm here to negotiate on behalf of the United States government, you'll probably laugh me out the door, and legitimately so, because that's not something that individuals do. That is something that elements of the state do that have that role. And with the DigiNotar incident in particular, where you saw digital certificates being issued that impersonated parts of the government, it's a very interesting echo of how that ability to engage with other states really depends on how trustworthy your communications are. A political scientist from Germany also had a definition that a state is a country, a territory and a government that has a monopoly on the use of force within that particular territory. Stuxnet actually undermines that in a way, because the use of force isn't necessarily violence between people. It can also be activities that break things, for instance, which was definitely the case with the attack on the Iranian nuclear installation in Natanz. And finally, states are also often identified by the fact that they provide some very critical key services, issuing passwords, being able to make it possible for people to receive mail in many countries still is actually a state-provided service. You can see that a lot of those services are slowly also being usurped by online services providers. So there's a lot of change to how states have actually worked with their citizens just in the last 25 years. And I think that isn't a bad thing, it's also not a good thing, it's just change. And so this is a very difficult time where we're all trying to manage that change and work through it. Now, in 1996, there was a hacker in the United States who goes by the name Dementor. His real name was Lloyd Blankenship. And he wrote this very interesting piece of text. I believe it was shortly after he was actually imprisoned for a crime at the time. And he makes this really compelling argument that the internet is actually something different. And on the internet, different rules apply. Now, I think today we have a very much more strong view on the fact that law also applies online. And so a lot of this no longer really holds true. But I think the principle behind it of we're dealing with a new technology that isn't just changing the way we use technology, but it's changing the way we actually live and breathe society, absolutely is true. And when you look at how the internet grows, you see that very same challenge rising and becoming bigger. Because if you look at internet adoption rates, first of all, congratulations Australia, you're actually all the way near the top, way beyond even the United States. But if you look at countries like India and China, they're just hovering around the 50% mark, which means that many, many, many more people are going to be coming online in the next few years than are actually online today. And for them, the internet means very different things, because keep in mind, many of them won't have a background to understand what cybercrime or cybersecurity issues are. Some of them will be users that use the internet in a very specific way, for instance, to get remote medical care, and won't be using a lot of the technologies that we today take for granted. Now, by itself, the internet becoming bigger is always a very, very good thing, but it also does make things a little bit tougher on countries and states. If you look at 2016, it was with this tweet that Mozilla announced that they actually saw over 50% of all HTTP requests being HTTPS. So that meant governments were silently going dark, and when they tried to monitor for things, they wouldn't be able to monitor them anymore. As a technologist, I think this is a good thing, but there's clearly a lot of societal issues related to that, where we need to have discussions and we need to have debates. So as countries have these rising concerns, it's very important for us as people that in many cases operate the network, that we realize that countries have different tacks that they take to look at this problem. Some countries, especially the ones that have issues like domestic terrorism or that have porous borders, are always going to look at cyber as a problem from a national security perspective. You see this a lot in Africa, where they're very concerned about security because they have other security issues, and they immediately think of the impacts that the internet is going to have on those issues. There's also countries that choose to prioritize social concerns. For instance, you see that a lot with very small countries where there might be issues with social cohesion or even really the understanding that there is such a thing as a country and a national viewpoint. They may actually see the internet as a way of improving social cohesion and making it easier for them to bring the country together. And finally, economic improvement is a very big one. You see that especially in Asia, where countries are doubling down on the internet as a way to increase commerce, increase trade, and drive innovation and leapfrog ahead of other countries. So there's many different countries that take completely different perspectives on these issues. And the challenge that we're now seeing is that those countries often don't trust each other because they have different priorities and they come from very different angles. I seem to need a charger for this laptop. Don't know. This might be the one. Let's give this a try. I think that's it. Great. Sorry for the technical interruption. So these countries often have issues trusting each other, and there's a couple of different ways why that is the case. The first one I already mentioned, legal frameworks. Another one is that you rarely really know which country did a particular act or took some particular action. The incidents earlier, there's a lot of assumptions. There's also a lot of attribution, but quite often that attribution is actually based on things that were gathered through signals intelligence or human intelligence, and it's not always based on something that smaller countries would necessarily have access to. And finally, there's a real problem with intent. For instance, if you run a power plant and you find malicious code on your power plant systems, That could be both to spy on how much power is actually being generated for part of the population and to measure economic growth in the long run, or it could be an attempt to sabotage your power plant. And the reality is, with today's malware that quite often allows you to do pretty much either of those, it's very, very difficult to actually determine intent behind a cyber attack. Luckily, there's been a lot of international cooperation so far, and this graph is just a quick view of how political scientists see the global cyber regime, so the different organizations that all partner together and work together on making the internet run. To me, this is always an eye-opener, because when I saw this, I wasn't really that interested in governance yet, and I was really looking at it from an engineer's perspective. And I saw the IETF building standards, and I saw companies implementing and operating large parts of that internet. But there's actually a lot of debate and discussion that ends up influencing those decisions even before they are made. When I said there's no real global legal frameworks, there actually is at least one that is fairly global, and that's the Budapest Convention. It was developed by the Council of Europe in the early 2000s. It was actually started being drafted in 1997, which is one of its problems. So it was developed before social media. It was developed before a lot of the online services we use today. But perhaps most importantly, the Budapest Convention struggles with the fact that it was absolutely developed by a number of states in Europe and in the West, and today they are trying to get other countries to adopt it. And because of that distrust that I mentioned, some other parts of the world are going to be more hesitant to adopt a legal framework that actually comes from a different part of the world. And so that's a big challenge that the Budapest Convention has run into, which means that today it's only ratified by about 63 countries out of about 187 recognized by the UN. There's also been voluntary proposals and partnerships, such as the Wassenaar Arrangement, which is actually an export control arrangement for dual-use goods. And it's actually fairly old, but more recently they have started looking at technologies such as intrusion and surveillance technology and see how they can actually regulate and restrict some of that. This has been a bit of a challenge because as they made decisions that actually made the work of security professionals very difficult. So the definition of intrusion software wasn't very clear. At a certain point in time, it even included, in many ways, debuggers that could be used to trace code. So luckily, there's been a lot of work on it over the last few years, with a lot of really solid engineers from the community providing input to the people designing Wassenaar and updating it. One approach that was taken by the UK government in 2011 was to start up a new process where a single country would host a major conference every 2 years approximately. And in that conference settle on a set of principles to govern behavior. So it wouldn't make decisions per se, but it would be a place for governments to come together, talk about some of these challenges and agree on rough outlines, work together towards more agreement that could then translate in either treaties or laws or any other types of output. Now, this process has been going on for a few years and it's actually had a lot of good effects. An organization came out of this called the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, which has been doing a lot of capacity building and preparing of documentation that new incident responders and security teams across the world can pick up. So it's been helpful. Right now, it's a little bit in a dormant phase because I think we're all waiting to figure out where the next meeting is going to be and what the focus of it will be. There's also been a couple of regional approaches. Within ASEAN specifically, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, there's been a lot of work to figure out how they can really best support cybersecurity capacity building. More recently, last year, they've started picking up a lot of more international efforts and promoting them within ASEAN, using what they call the ASEAN Way, which is really all about building more predictable relationships rather than having hard commitments and agreements. Within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, there's also been a push, but that push has been more to propose a strong international code of conduct under the United Nations that everyone would agree on. And that process has stalled a little bit and converted into some other mechanisms I'll talk about in a second. Now, the interesting thing about regional approaches is that technology isn't really regional in the sense that many technologies are built in a country, used across the globe. And it makes it quite challenging when regions take a very specific tack for other countries to easily trust and buy into those approaches. A little bit similar to what happened originally with the Budapest Convention. In the United Nations, there's been a lot of work ongoing. Since 1998, there's actually been an annual report from the Secretary General of the UN on cybersecurity. Interestingly enough, can anyone guess which country has responded to every call since this process actually started? It's a bit unexpected. So the country that got started responding and continued to respond every year was actually Cuba. And the reason why they responded was because they wanted to flag the concern of radio transmissions from the United States sending propaganda into Cuba. Now, the reason why this is interesting is because it shows you how different states perceive information security and cybersecurity. So something to be aware of, that we're coming from very far and we're slowly all moving a little bit closer, hopefully. The ITU has done a lot of work on cybersecurity capacity building. They have their global cybersecurity agenda, but I specifically want to dive deep for a second into the UN Group of Governmental Experts, which is a group that's being convened every couple of years of UN member states, where they actually work together and try to come up with a consensus view on cybersecurity. And of one of the groups that actually managed to gain a consensus view of the countries participating, which was 16 in total, in 2015, the UNGGE published this set of norms, as they call it, which were responsible rules of behavior for states on the internet. Some of these are really interesting. For instance, one of the statements in here is that a country should never attack the national computer security incident response team of another country, because they really need to be available to deal with security incidents when they happen. Now, this initiative is continuing. The last one that was initiated in 2016, I believe, didn't unfortunately get to a consensus view, so they didn't publish any output. But they are starting again this year with two different initiatives, actually, both endorsed by the UN General Assembly. There will be the Government Group of Experts, which is 25 selected member states, including Australia. Congratulations. That will be working on identifying more of these types of norms, more of these types of behaviors that should be encouraged within the global community. And then there will also be a second group called the Open-Ended Working Group, which is going to be focused on identifying and progressing the implementation of the work that's already been done by the UNGGE. And it's quite interesting because both of them will allow input from a slightly different perspective. The GGE will this year allow regional bodies, such as ASEAN, to provide input, and the Open-Ended Working Group will actually allow input from non-profit organizations, businesses, and so on. So there will be a lot more opportunities to participate. Now, within the UN, there's also a bigger initiative called the Internet Governance Forum, which is now one of the largest UN conferences. It happens once a year, and it's really intended to bring together a multi-stakeholder community. So very much looking at it from a governance perspective instead of a government perspective. It brings together civil society, it brings together government, private sector and international government to debate some of these challenges in a very, very open forum. And a few years ago, this group determined that they needed to have more tangible outputs. So they started working on something called the Best Practices Forum on Cybersecurity. And this is a really interesting initiative because it actually allows all of you as individuals or as your companies or as your organizations to provide input on a lot of these challenges. This year, one of the things that we're doing with the group is to review international agreements that have been signed either between or undersigned by countries or by different companies and government agencies or multi-stakeholder groups, and actually looking at some of the commitments that they make. For instance, one of them has a commitment around vulnerability equities processes, and then identifying what best practices there are that others can pick up and implement. So it can really serve as a catalyst for this type of work. And that brings me to where the industry today is really going, or the community is going, and that's norms. Me and my partner drove here from Sydney, and one of the wonderful things I noticed about Australia was that everyone on the highway actually drives approximately the same speed, which is fantastic. That's not a law, at least I don't think it is, in the sense that you have a minimum speed and a maximum speed, but a norm is that you drive approximately the same speed, and even if you're not speeding, if you fly past me very, very quickly, you're going to make me quite annoyed, and I'm going to react to that, and in essence, you violated a norm. Now, norms come from social science, rather, and the idea behind them is that they are collective expectations that we have on a particular actor with a particular identity. Norms emerge because people agree that something is the right thing to do and they start expecting it. They cascade because people start reacting to a violation of a norm, such as, for instance, deploying a malicious software update. And finally, they're internalized when people believe it's the right thing to do, and they automatically start implementing the right course of action and start doing the right things. Norms can come from any wide set of a community of different organizations, both governments, but also private sector. For instance, Microsoft published a norm, which you see here at the bottom, which was a proposal that global ICT companies should always issue patches to protect users, regardless of the attacker and their motives. Now, norms too are not a panacea. They're not a solution for everything. There's actually 3 big problems with them. There's attribution. When you don't know who violated the norm, it's very difficult for you to call them out as a norms violator. It's very easy on the road because you see who it is. They have a license plate. Cyber is a little bit different. There's a problem with implementation because states may sign up to a norm, but if they don't implement the mechanisms internally to actually live up to it, it's not really working. And finally, there's no real enforcement. So that brings us to the fact that norms really aren't a solution for everything. In fact, I would say norms, laws, treaties, they're all just tools. But what we need to work on as a community is getting agreement on some of these basic issues. And we've been successful at this in many different parts of our communities and societies. We're great at this with search and rescue. There's many different search and rescue agreements across countries that make helping people very, very easy. In sports, we're fantastic at this. We do global sports events where even countries that can't participate in anything else can go and participate in the Olympics. So we're good at this in some areas, but we really still need to grow. And so how can you contribute? I think the most important takeaway for me, having done some of this work now for a little while, is that we need to recognize that engineering and policy run at slightly different speeds. But the conversations between the two need to happen and need to be in place in order for us to actually get what we want, which is a stable and solid internet that we can all rely on. Right now we're in this really strange place where everyone is really looking at each other and trying to learn what it is that they're doing that's working. For instance, vulnerability equities processes, the ability to weigh whether a vulnerability that you found as a government is something you want to use to attack or to actually defend everyone by reporting it to the vendor is a very, very important thing. And you see that now there's 2 countries that have implemented them. There's many more that are considering doing it. But the conversation still needs to happen. There's many different forums where you can participate. Some of the ones I mentioned in the UN are very state-centric. There are several that are more open to private sector as well and civil society. The Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, launched by France, is perhaps the best example. And so I kind of want to leave you with this slide, which gives you a bit of an overview where you as an individual can participate. And I'll also add that within the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams, we have a working group to determine what is important to incident responders globally and feed it back into many of these mechanisms. So I'd also like to invite you, even if you're not a member of FIRST, feel free to reach out and send me an email if you have ideas, thoughts, because right now what is happening is a war of ideas and figuring out what is it actually that all of us agree on and building from there into a better community. So it's really important that everyone gets on board and provides their input, and I'd really like to invite you to become part of the process. And happy to answer questions. We're pretty much out of time, but I'll be around here after the session, so feel free to reach out to me or send me an email, and happy to get you involved in any way that's practical for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maarten. We do have time maybe for 1 or 2 questions if there are any. No? All right. Thank you very much, mate.
Thank you.
And I'll give you the best speaker gift you've ever had.
This is absolutely the best speaker gift ever.
Fantastic,
Thank you
isn't
very
it?
much. Cheers. And thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.